Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolds slowly, methodically, like the turning of pages in a book you can't quite put down. It's a story about trust and betrayal, about the mask people wear and the secrets they keep. So close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you to Melbourne, Australia, where on a warm summer evening in January of 2010, a birthday celebration would end in a way no one could have predicted. Chris Soteria seemed to have everything. Born in Cyprus, he had come to Australia as a 12-year-old boy with his family, leaving behind a war-torn homeland for the promise of a better life in Melbourne. The Soterio family settled in Reservoir, a working-class suburb, and young Chris learned early the value of hard work and determination. By the time he reached his 40s, Chris had transformed himself into the embodiment of the Australian dream. He was a successful engineer and businessman, working on prestigious projects, including infrastructure for the 2000 Sydney Olympics. His income had grown to $600,000 a year. He drove fast cars, wore designer clothes, and took his family on luxury holidays. But more than the material success, Chris was proud of his family. He had 3 children, including a set of twins, and by all appearances, a loving marriage to his wife, Vicky. Vicky Soterio was beautiful, attentive, and seemed devoted to her husband, to their friends and neighbors in the tight-knit Greek-Australian community of Watsonia North. They were the ideal couple. They hosted barbecues, celebrated name days and holidays with extended family, and their home was filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing. Chris believed he had a harmonious marriage. Sure, there were moments when he caught Vicky in small lies, little inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. But what marriage was perfect. He loved her, and he believed she loved him. After all, she told him so, repeatedly. She said she loved him to death. What Chris didn't know was that Vicky had been living a double life for years. Ori Dimitrakis had known Vicky since 1994. He was a self-employed limousine driver, a man who drifted through life with few anchors. In early 1995, during a time when Vicky felt pressured by family expectations, she had reconnected with Ori, and they began a relationship. But Vicky ultimately chose a different path, marrying Chris Soterio instead. Years passed. Vicky and Chris built their life together, had their children, accumulated wealth. But sometime around 2008, Vicky reconnected with Ari Dimitrakis, and their relationship reignited with an intensity that consumed them both. This wasn't a casual affair. Vicky and Ari met in hotel rooms, exchanged passionate notes, and made promises to each other. Vicky had Ari's name tattooed on her wedding ring finger, hidden beneath her wedding band where Chris would never see it. She had his initials tattooed at her hairline, at the back of her neck. She and Ari even purchased burial plots together, planning for an eternity side by side. They talked about leaving their spouses, about finally being together openly. But Vicky had a problem. She enjoyed the lifestyle that Chris provided. The luxury, the security, the financial comfort. Chris had over $2 million in superannuation alone. If she divorced him, she would be entitled to a portion, perhaps $3 million. But if Chris died while they were still married, she would inherit everything. $7 million. The mathematics of murder had entered Vicky's mind. This wasn't the first time Vicky had considered killing her husband. Years earlier, in 2005, Vicky had been having an affair with another man, Tony Alexovsky. One day, at a motel in Preston, she made him an extraordinary proposition. She asked him to kill Chris. She offered him $50,000 in cash. Tony thought she was joking, He laughed it off, uncomfortable but not quite believing she was serious. When he realized she meant it, he refused. Shortly after that conversation, Vicky ended their affair, but the seed had been planted in her mind, and it would grow over the following years until it consumed her completely. On the evening of January 2nd, 2010, Vicky organized a surprise party for Chris's 44th birthday. She booked a table at Alpha Uziri, a popular Greek restaurant on Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, one of Melbourne's most vibrant neighborhoods. Friends and family gathered to celebrate. There was food, wine, laughter. It was exactly the kind of celebration Chris loved, surrounded by the people who mattered most to him. Throughout the evening, Vicky was attentive and affectionate. She kept promising Chris that the night would end with a special surprise. She was playful, teasing, saying over and over that he was going to get lucky tonight, that she had something wonderful planned. Chris was happy. He had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. But earlier that day, before the party, Vicky had met Ari Dimitrakis in a park. She handed him something wrapped in a towel. It was a knife, a kitchen knife that Chris himself had given Vicky as a Christmas present years earlier. Vicky looked at Ari and said simply, "See you tonight." Ari took the knife. He later claimed he had taken too many pills that day, that he was in a fog, that he couldn't remember what happened next. But that's not quite true. He knew what he was supposed to do. He knew where to wait. After the party ended, Chris and Vicky walked back toward their car. They were laughing, hugging, reminiscing about what a beautiful evening it had been. Chris felt warm with wine and friendship, completely unsuspecting, his arm around his wife. They turned down a side street in Fitzroy. It was darker there, quieter. And then someone grabbed Chris from behind. He felt hands on his jacket collar, pulling him backward. Before he could react, before he could even understand what was happening, he felt something cold against his throat. A blade. It moved across his neck in one swift, deep motion. Then came the stabbing. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 6, 7 times. The knife plunged into his chest, his torso, his abdomen. Chris would later say that in those moments he felt no pain. His body went into shock. He was aware of what was happening, but it felt surreal, like watching a scene from a movie in which he was somehow the main character. He saw Vicky standing nearby, watching. He didn't understand why wasn't she helping. Why wasn't she screaming? The attacker ran off into the night. Chris staggered, his hands going to his throat. Blood was pouring from the wound, hot and fast. His white shirt was turning red. His legs felt weak. And then, by extraordinary chance, 2 off-duty doctors happened to be walking past. They saw Chris, saw the blood, and immediately rushed to help. One of them pressed his hands against Chris's throat, trying to stop the arterial bleeding. The other called for an ambulance. Those 2 doctors, in the right place at the right time, saved Chris Soteria's life in those crucial first minutes. Without them, he would have bled out on that Fitzroy street before the ambulance could arrive. At the hospital, Chris's condition was catastrophic. He had been stabbed 7 times. His throat had been slashed so deeply that both sides had to be stitched back together. His liver was lacerated and draining. His lungs had to be artificially inflated. He had lost tremendous amounts of blood. The medical team fought to save him. They worked through the night, performing emergency surgery, giving him transfusions, monitoring every vital sign. At several points, Chris nearly died from multiple organ failure. His body was strong, fortunately. He had always been fit, had taken care of himself. That physical resilience made the difference between life and death. The doctors placed Chris in a medically induced coma. He would remain unconscious for 3 weeks. His body given time to begin the long process of healing. During those weeks, his family maintained a vigil at his bedside. His children, his extended family, his friends, everyone except Vicky, who seemed strangely detached from the horror of what had happened. When Chris finally woke from his coma, weak and confused, trying to understand where he was and what had happened, the police were there waiting to speak with him. They had to tell him something that would shatter his world, far more completely than the knife wounds had shattered his body. They told him that his wife, Vicky, had been having an affair, that she and her lover, Ari Dimitrakis, had planned the attack, that Vicky had given Ari the knife, that she had insisted on driving Chris to the party herself, making sure she controlled when and where they would leave, that she had arranged everything, orchestrated every detail of what was meant to be her husband's murder. Chris couldn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it. This was the woman he had married 17 years earlier, the mother of his children, his partner in building the life they shared. How could she want him dead? But the evidence was overwhelming. The police had interviewed witnesses, including neighbors who had seen Ari Dimitrakis lurking around the Soterio home for months, acting strangely. Watching, particularly observant neighbor had even taken photographs with dates and times, documenting Dimitrakis' stalking behavior. The police had also interviewed Vicky. In those early interviews, she admitted to the affair but tried to minimize her role. She claimed she hadn't wanted Chris killed, that Ari must have acted on his own, perhaps out of some misguided jealousy. But the evidence told a different story. Cell phone records, text messages, witness statements. The plot had been carefully planned. Ari Dimitrakis was arrested first. He eventually agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of intentionally causing serious injury, rather than attempted murder. In exchange, he agreed to testify against Vicky. The court heard how Vicky had given him the knife, how she had planned the timing, how she had promised they could finally be together once Chris was gone. At his sentencing, Justice Paul Coughlin described the plot as callous, cold-blooded, and well-planned. Dimitrakis was sentenced to 7 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years to serve. Chris's brother John, sitting in the courtroom, called Dimitrakis a coward and stormed out, outraged at what he felt was too lenient a sentence. But the main trial was yet to come. Vicky Soterio pleaded not guilty. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial, even as evidence mounted against her. The jury heard testimony about the affair, about the tattoos, about the burial plots purchased together. They heard about the 2005 conversation where Vicky had tried to hire another lover to kill Chris. They heard about the knife given to Ari hours before the attack. They heard about Vicky's strange behavior at the hospital, her lack of emotion, her seeming detachment. The trial captured national attention in Australia. It had all the elements of a Greek tragedy, as some observers noted. Passion, betrayal, violence, family loyalty tested to its breaking point. Through it all, Chris attended the proceedings, still recovering from his injuries, still trying to understand how the woman he loved could have orchestrated his murder. On October 7th, 2011, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Vicky Soterio was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Chris's family embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Vicky showed little reaction, sitting quietly with her parents beside her. At her sentencing, Justice Elizabeth Curtin spoke directly to Vicky. She told her that while she hadn't wielded the knife herself, she had intended Chris's death just as surely as if she had. She spoke about the profound sense of betrayal Chris must feel, knowing that his wife had tried to have him killed on his 44th birthday. Of all days, she noted that Vicky had shown highly manipulative conduct, and that if the plan had succeeded, 3 children would have been left without a father. Vicky Soterio was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with a minimum of 9 years before she would be eligible for parole. Outside the courthouse, Chris told reporters he was relieved the trial was over, so he could begin to move on. But he also said he still couldn't make sense of the whole tragic event. How could someone he loved, someone he trusted completely, want him dead? While Chris was recovering in the hospital during those early days, Vicky's family had gone to the Soterio home. They removed items worth approximately $100,000. Vicky herself withdrew $200,000 from their bank accounts. When Chris discovered these actions, it added insult to his injuries, both literal and figurative. Chris later sued Vicky for civil damages, seeking compensation for the psychological trauma, the medical costs, and the loss of his ability to work. He testified that the psychological shock was so severe that he could no longer maintain his previous level of professional engagement. The court eventually awarded him $2.4 million in civil damages, but collecting that money proved almost impossible. While Vicky was in prison, her family helped her transfer property assets into their names, attempting to shield the money from Chris's claim. He was forced to take legal action against Vicky's parents and her sister, seeking the money he was owed. The financial and legal battles would continue for years, adding layers of stress to an already devastating situation. Perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence of the crime was its impact on Chris's relationship with his eldest daughter. Before Vicky was convicted, she and her family convinced the girl that Chris had actually orchestrated the attack himself as a way to frame Vicky. They told her that her father was the villain, not her mother. Even after Vicky's conviction, even after all the evidence had been presented in court, Chris's daughter continued to believe that her mother was innocent and her father was to blame. She refused to speak to Chris. The relationship was severed, and Chris could do nothing but hope that someday, somehow, she would see the truth. In an interview years later, Chris spoke about this estrangement with visible emotion. He said he hoped his daughter was okay, that his door would always be open to her, and that he wanted her to know his version of events was the truth. But he couldn't force her to listen. He couldn't force her to forgive him for something he hadn't done. Despite everything, Chris Soterio worked to rebuild his life. He focused on his younger children, especially his twins, walking them to and from school every day. He found love again with a new partner, someone he described as a strong, spiritual, balanced person, a beautiful soul. He also channeled his experience into helping other crime victims navigate the legal system. He established the Powerhouse Retreat, a facility designed to support victims and their families during lengthy court proceedings, providing them with accommodation and guidance through one of the most difficult periods of their lives. Chris told interviewers that he wanted to make sure other people didn't go through what he had gone through with the legal system after such an ordeal. His own experience had taught him how vulnerable and lost victims can feel when thrust into the criminal justice process. He wanted to create something that would make that journey a little less lonely for others. In interviews, Chris spoke about the importance of forgiveness, not for Vicky's sake, but for his own peace of mind. He said, "You never forget what happened, but you have to forgive and move on. Life is a journey with its ups and downs." He had sunk to the lowest level, but had risen again, and life was now beautiful. New partner, new lifestyle, new purpose. In early 2022, after serving 10 years of her 12-year sentence, Vicky Soterio was quietly released from the Dame Phyllis Frost Maximum Security Correctional Center. She had served her time largely without incident, and was released with various restrictions placed on her movements and activities. She returned to life in Melbourne's northern suburbs, living with family members, trying to rebuild a life far different from the one she had known before. Ari Dimitrakis had been released even earlier, having served 7 years. Chris was notified of Vicky's impending release weeks before it happened. He opposed the decision, but ultimately had no power to prevent it. When asked about it by reporters, he declined to comment extensively, but his previous words echoed, "Life is a journey. You have to forgive and move on." And so the story of Chris Soterio comes to its conclusion, though perhaps it's a story that has no real ending. The physical wounds healed, leaving scars that Chris would carry for the rest of his life. The emotional and psychological wounds run deeper still, visible in different ways. The loss of trust, the shattering of the belief that he knew the person he had married, the estrangement from his daughter, the years of legal battles and financial stress. But there's also resilience in this story. The remarkable fact of Chris's survival, the result of chance, the presence of those 2 doctors at exactly the right moment. The strength he found to rebuild his life, to love again, to help others, the determination to be present for his children, to find meaning in the aftermath of trauma. What makes someone capable of planning the murder of their spouse? What combination of greed, obsession, and moral detachment allows a person to hand a knife to their lover and say, "See you tonight," knowing that by night's end, the father of their children might be dead? These are questions that haunted Chris, and they're questions without satisfying answers. Vicky never fully explained her actions beyond saying they were stupid and silly, words that seemed grotesquely inadequate for the magnitude of what she planned and nearly succeeded in carrying out. The case reminds us that we can never fully know another person, no matter how long we've lived beside them, shared meals with them, raised children with them. People carry secrets, sometimes dark and terrible ones. They construct facades that can last years, even decades, and sometimes those facades slip and the person underneath is unrecognizable. And so we leave Chris Soteria in Melbourne living his rebuilt life, carrying his scars both visible and invisible, walking his children to school, loving his new partner, helping other crime victims find their way through the darkness he once walked through himself. His story is one of survival against extraordinary odds, of the random chance that placed two doctors on a Fitzroy Street at exactly the moment they were needed, of the strength required to wake from a coma and learn that your entire life was built on a foundation of lies, of the courage needed to face your attacker and your betrayer in a courtroom and then somehow move forward into an uncertain future. It's late now. The story is told. Let yourself rest. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Whatever darkness exists in the world, whatever capacity for betrayal and violence humans carry within them, there's also resilience, kindness, the presence of those two doctors who didn't turn away, the friend who takes photographs that become evidence, the justice system that, however imperfectly, seeks to assign responsibility and consequence. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we'll walk together through the events surrounding Molly Watson, a woman who dreamed of her fairy tale wedding, only to have those dreams end on a dark country road just 48 hours before she was meant to say I do. Let your breathing slow. This is a story of love and lies, of secrets carefully kept and truths that couldn't stay hidden forever. Our story begins in Moberly, Missouri, a small town where everyone knows everyone, where life moves at the gentle pace of the seasons. On December 15, 1982, Timothy and Sandra Watson welcomed their daughter into the world. They named her Molly Nicole Watson. From the beginning, Molly was different in all the best ways. She was intelligent, creative, a girl who saw the world through a unique lens. She excelled in school, absorbing knowledge like sunlight. As she grew, her passions bloomed. She loved to sing, her voice carrying through the rooms of her childhood home. She loved creating costumes, elaborate and colorful, stitching together fabrics and imagination, and she loved documenting her life, recording video diaries on YouTube where she shared her thoughts, her dreams, her authentic self with anyone who cared to listen. Molly struggled with Asperger's syndrome, but she was highly functioning and never let it define her. Instead, it was simply part of who she was. Part of what made her see the world a little differently, a little more intensely. She had a son, Declan, whom she adored. He was her world, the center of her universe, and she made sure he knew it every single day. After a first marriage ended in divorce, Molly found herself in a relationship with Amber Brady, a childhood friend. For about 5 years, they shared their lives together. They understood each other, communicated well, enjoyed the same things. It simply clicked. But like many relationships, this one eventually ran its course, ending in a way that left both women moving forward separately. And then Molly's life took a new turn. She got a job at the Moberly Area Correctional Center, working as a corrections officer. It was 2011. She was 28 years old. And it was there behind those walls that she met James Addy. James Addy was 51 years old when Molly met him. He wore the uniform of a corrections officer with authority, having worked his way up through the ranks to become a lieutenant. To look at him, you might see a man of responsibility, a man of order. He had been married 4 times before. 4 times he had stood at an altar and made promises. 4 times those promises had eventually broken. But when Molly looked at him, she saw something else. She saw a man she could love, a man she could trust, a man who told her he was going through a divorce that would be finalized soon. Just a matter of paperwork, he said. Just a matter of time. Molly's brother Tim would later say she was absolutely 100% in love with Addie. And indeed, she was. For 7 years, their relationship continued. 7 years of phone calls and secret meetings. 7 years of Molly believing that soon they would be able to be together openly to build a life without having to hide. Addie had a way about him that made Molly look past certain things. Her family noticed it though. Tim Watson, Molly's brother, felt uneasy around James from the start. There was something evasive about him, something that didn't quite sit right. He could never look you in the eye when he spoke. His answers were always indirect, dancing around direct questions. He put off what Tim called bad vibes to everybody. Some family members became so uncomfortable with James that they told Molly they wouldn't even attend the wedding. But Molly saw past all of that. Love has a way of softening the edges of our doubts, of painting over the warning signs with brighter colors. She believed in the future James promised her. What Molly didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that James Addie was living two completely separate lives. Every night, he went home to a house in Santa Fe, Missouri. Not a large house, just a simple 3-bedroom home in the rural countryside. And in that house lived his wife, Melanie Addie, his wife of 23 years. His wife who had no idea that her husband was engaged to another woman. Melanie would later describe their marriage as normal. Sometimes good, sometimes challenging, but normal. James came home every night. He was there for dinner. He helped around the house. He absolutely hated people who had affairs, she said, so she never would have thought him capable of having one. They had 2 children together, Ben and Emma. Emma was still living at home, a bright young woman attending Paris High School. She knew her father as any daughter would, flawed perhaps, but hers. She had no idea about Molly Watson. No idea that her father was planning a wedding while still sleeping in the same house, the same bed with her mother. The lies James Addie told were intricate, layered, maintained with careful precision. To Molly, he spun tales of a divorce that kept getting delayed. To Melanie, he never mentioned Molly at all. When he traveled to Mexico or Florida with Molly, vacations where they smiled for photos, arms wrapped around each other, he told Melanie it was work training. He even provided her with official-looking letters from the prison explaining his absences. Sniper training in Florida, he said, prison work in Mexico. And Melanie believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was her husband, the father of her children, the man who came home every single night. In 2018, after 7 years together, James Addie finally proposed to Molly Watson. She said yes without hesitation. Her dreams were finally coming true. Molly threw herself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. She envisioned a beautiful ceremony at the Stony Creek Hotel and Conference Center in Columbia, Missouri. The date was set, April 29th, 2018. The theme would be Renaissance-inspired, with touches of Disney magic, because Molly still believed in fairy tales. The colors would be burgundy and gold. There would be flowers and candles and music. She bought not 1 but 2 wedding dresses, because she simply couldn't decide which one made her feel more like a bride. She tried them on, twirling in front of mirrors, recording videos of herself, documenting every moment of this journey toward her happily ever after. Sam Cohen, the wedding planner, worked with Molly on every detail. From Molly's perspective, it was going to be a beautiful wedding, and the best day ever. The excitement in Molly's voice was unmistakable. This was what she had been waiting for. But as the wedding day approached, something changed. A few weeks before the ceremony, Molly contacted the wedding planner with unfortunate news. They needed to reduce the guest list. James had told her something tragic. His ex-wife Melanie had been in a terrible car accident during Christmas 4 months earlier. She'd been on life support ever since. And now, just weeks before the wedding, James and his children had made the impossible decision to let her go. Melanie had died, he told Molly. The family was grieving. They couldn't invite as many people to the wedding now. It wouldn't be appropriate. Molly believed him. She sent the wedding planner an email explaining the situation, her heart breaking for the man she loved, and the loss his family was experiencing. She made the adjustments. She understood. Of course, Melanie Addie had never been in any car accident. She was alive and well, living in the same house with James, sleeping beside him every night, completely unaware that her husband was telling people she was dead. On April 25th, 2018, 48 hours before the wedding, James Addy and Molly Watson walked into the Randolph County Recorder of Deeds office to obtain their marriage license. Mark Price, the Recorder of Deeds, prepared their paperwork. He would later recall that Molly seemed pleasant, excited. James, on the other hand, seemed perturbed by some of the questions he was asked. There was an edge to him, a tension. The marriage license was issued. In 2 days, they would be husband and wife. Except James Addy was already a husband, already married. The marriage license in Molly's hand was meaningless. Illegal, actually. If they went through with the ceremony, it would be bigamy. But Molly didn't know that. Friday night, April 27th, 2018, just 1 day before the wedding. At the Addy home in Santa Fe, the evening began like any other. Melanie got off work, and she and James went out to dinner in Mexico, Missouri. They came home. It was an ordinary night. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, James left the house. He was wearing a black jacket, blue jeans, and boots. He told Melanie he was going to visit a friend. Emma, their daughter, was home that evening, working on an online class assignment. She was a junior at Paris High School, focused on her studies, unaware that her world was about to shatter. Meanwhile, in Huntsville, Missouri, Molly Watson was at home. Her phone rang. It was James. They talked as she got into her car. The phone records would later show that they stayed on the call as she drove. As she navigated the dark country roads leading out of town, they were still on the phone as she turned onto Route M, as she crossed Highway 151, as she drove toward a remote area near Middle Grove, a place where a creek crossed the road, where the trees grew thick and the darkness was absolute. This was their plan, it seemed, to meet here, in this isolated place. Perhaps James told her he wanted to see her before the wedding. Perhaps he said he had a gift for her, or that he needed to tell her something important. We don't know what words passed between them during that drive. We only know that Molly trusted him completely. She was driving to meet the man she would marry in just over 24 hours. The area where she stopped was desolate. A low-water creek crossing, the kind of place you'd only know about if you live locally. The kind of place where, if you wanted to be alone, you could be completely, utterly alone. Molly got out of her car. Her marriage license was on the passenger seat. And then in the darkness of that rural Missouri road, James Addy pulled out a gun, a .22 caliber weapon. He positioned himself behind Molly Watson, the woman who loved him, the woman who had bought 2 wedding dresses and planned a ceremony with burgundy and gold decorations, and who had waited 7 years for this moment. He pressed the gun against the back of her head. Then he fired. A single bullet entered Molly's skull at point-blank range, lodging deep in her brain. She had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. She collapsed immediately. The life that had been so full of singing and creating and dreaming ended in an instant on that dark road. James Addy then dragged her body, positioning it in the road in front of her car. In the process, her clothing was pulled, leaving her partially unclothed. He left her there in the dirt and in the darkness, and then he went home. Glenn McSparren was taking a shortcut that Friday night. He was driving home from his mother's house, navigating the rural roads he knew well. It was around 10 o'clock in the evening. As his headlights swept across the road ahead, he saw something unusual. A car pulled off to the side near the creek crossing. Then, as he got closer, his headlights illuminated something that made his heart stop. A body, a woman, lying in the road. When I saw her, I swear my heart stopped. I could tell she wasn't moving. McSparren would later recall. He immediately called 911. The operator instructed him to check for a pulse, but Glenn already knew. I looked in her eyes and I could tell that she was gone. But here's something crucial. About 30 minutes before Glenn McSparren discovered Molly's body, he had driven past this same spot, and he had seen someone, a man, standing by the road. The man seemed to be acting strangely, suspiciously. McSparren drove on, thinking little of it at the time. Only later would he realize what he had witnessed. When the Monroe County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene, they found Molly Watson, 35 years old. 1 day before her wedding, she was still wearing her engagement ring. This was not a robbery. In her car, they found the marriage license. The groom's name, James Addy, addressed Santa Fe, Missouri. The officers knew what they had to do. Someone had to notify the groom that his bride-to-be had been killed. It was around 2:20 in the morning when Missouri Highway Patrol Master Sergeant Bradley Ream drove to the address listed on the marriage license. He knocked on the door of the Addy home. James Addy answered. Sergeant Ream began to explain about Molly Watson, about the tragedy that had occurred. And then, from a side room, a woman appeared. I asked who she was, and she said, "I am his wife." And he said she was his wife. Ream later testified. The officer was stunned. The groom was already married, had been married for 23 years, to be exact. Melanie Addy stood there in her own home, learning for the first time that her husband had been in a 7-year relationship with another woman, that he had planned to marry this woman the next day, that this woman was now dead. The investigation began immediately. James Addy told investigators that on the evening of April 27th, he had gone to visit a friend, but the friend wasn't home, so he had driven around for a while before returning home. He said he got home around 8:30 in the evening, but Emma, his daughter, told a different story. She said her father didn't come home until around 10 o'clock, significantly later than he claimed. She was in the bathroom brushing her teeth when he arrived. He came and stood in the doorway in his underwear, then walked out to the dining room to get food from the microwave. He looked antsy, she said. She noticed he was doing laundry, and there was a strong smell of bleach. After James was taken to the police station for questioning, Melanie began searching their home. She needed to understand what had happened, what her husband had been hiding. In the garage, she found nothing. But when she climbed up to the attic, she discovered boxes. Molly's boxes. Boxes that Molly had been slowly moving into what she thought would become her marital home. Inside were photo albums. Page after page of pictures. James and Molly in Mexico, smiling in the sun. James and Molly in Florida, arms around each other. 7 years of photographs documenting a relationship that Melanie never knew existed. 7 years of vacations she thought her husband had taken for work. The investigators worked quickly, methodically. They collected evidence from the crime scene. They found tire impressions in the dirt near where Molly's body lay. When they examined James Addy's vehicle, the tires matched, not conclusively. The expert would later testify he couldn't be 100% certain. But they were consistent. They found a t-shirt in a field near the crime scene. It was covered in blood. Molly's blood. The shirt was unusual, distinctive. When shown a photo of it, Emma Addy recognized it immediately. She had made it herself for a class project and given it to her father. They searched James Addy's home and found ammunition, 22 caliber rounds. The same caliber as the bullet lodged in Molly Watson's skull. An empty ammunition box found near the crime scene was consistent with the brand found in Addy's home. A gun was found in plain sight in his house. A 22 caliber weapon. However, no DNA evidence linked the gun directly to Molly, and no gunpowder residue was found on it. This would be a weakness in the prosecution's case. They discovered that James had a secret phone, a second phone he used exclusively to communicate with Molly. The phone record showed the calls between them on the night of April 27th, tracking Molly's journey from her home to the place where she died. And then there was the search history on Molly's phone. The day before she was killed, Molly had searched for something specific. Melanie Addy's obituary. Had she finally begun to suspect? Had doubts crept in about the story James had told her? We'll never know. But she had searched for proof that the woman James claimed was dead had actually died. She found nothing, of course, because Melanie Addy was alive. On April 28, 2018, less than 24 hours after Molly's body was discovered, James Addy was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, an armed criminal action. In the days that followed, Molly's family prepared for a funeral instead of a wedding. The venue that should have been filled with joy and celebration instead held grief and disbelief. Molly's brother, Tim, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Their parents, Timothy and Sandra Watson, were shattered. Molly's son, Declan, had lost his mother. The woman who had loved him more than anything in the world was gone. Melanie Addy filed for divorce. After 23 years of marriage, she learned that the man she shared her life with was a stranger. She later told the press that James was a pretty selfish person. He could be controlling and intimidating. He could be challenging. When asked if she thought he was capable of murder, she said it seemed like something he would do to fix a problem. Emma Addy, their daughter, never spoke to her father again after his arrest. The man she had known her entire life had killed someone, had been living a lie, had destroyed not just one family, but two. The case took 3 years to come to trial. 3 years of delays, of venue changes, of a pandemic that slowed the wheels of justice. Finally, in April 2021, 3 years to the month after Molly's death, James Addy sat in a Cole County courtroom to face a jury of his peers. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, piece by piece constructing a picture of guilt. They presented the phone records showing James and Molly on the phone as she drove to her death. They showed the tire impressions from the crime scene that were consistent with James's vehicle. They brought forward the bloody t-shirt, with Emma's tearful testimony that she had made it for her father. They displayed the ammunition found in James's home, connecting it to the mullet that killed Molly. They called Melanie to the stand. She testified about the night of the murder, about James leaving around 7 and returning home late. She testified about finding the photo albums in the attic, about the 7 years of lies. Emma testified too, with her father watching, tears in his eyes. She told the jury about the night he came home late, about the smell of bleach, about his anxious demeanor. It was a moment of profound tragedy. A daughter testifying against her father in a murder trial. 2 inmates who had been in jail with James while he awaited trial testified that they had asked him about his high bail. According to their testimony, James allegedly responded that he had put someone face down in a ditch. The defense would argue these inmates couldn't be trusted, that they had reasons to lie. The wedding planner testified about Molly's excitement, about the email regarding James's supposedly deceased wife, about a bride who was planning what she believed would be the best day of her life. Glenn McSparron testified about finding Molly's body, about seeing a man acting suspiciously in the same location 30 minutes earlier. However, he couldn't positively identify that man as James Addy, a significant weakness in the prosecution's case. The medical examiner explained that Molly died from a contact gunshot wound to the back of the head, meaning the gun was pressed directly against her skull when it was fired. The defense argued that the state's case was built on assumptions, that James had an affair, yes, but an affair doesn't make someone a murderer. They pointed out the lack of DNA evidence linking James to the gun found in his home. They highlighted that the tire expert couldn't definitively say the impressions matched James's car. They questioned the credibility of the jailhouse informants. Defense attorney T.J. Kirsch repeatedly asked the jury, "Where's the evidence? Where's the proof beyond a reasonable doubt?" But the prosecution had an answer to that question. In closing arguments, they painted a picture of a coward, a man who had lied to 2 women for 7 years, who had created an elaborate web of deceit, and who, when that web was about to collapse, chose murder over truth. The prosecutor said, the defendant was a coward when Molly was alive, and he couldn't tell her the truth, and he was the coward when he couldn't look her in the eye when he killed her. The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. On April 29th, 2021, 3 years to the day when Molly and James should have been celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, the verdict was read: guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of armed criminal action. James Addy looked down as the verdict was announced. His daughter Emma was not in the courtroom. Melanie was not there either. The family he had once had was gone. Before sentencing, Molly's family was given the opportunity to speak. Tim Watson, Molly's brother, stood before the court. "Molly was my best friend, my sister that I'll never see again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. This monster took from not only I, but all the family and friends who loved her. He explained that the tragedy hadn't ended with Molly's death. The stress and heartache had taken a profound toll on their parents. Their father, Timothy Watson Sr., had died of a heart attack in September 2020. Their mother, Sandra, had died just months after that. "I feel like James Addy took my entire family away from me," Tim said. Then someone read a statement from Molly's son, Declan. In it, he described his mother as the most important person in his life. "Amazing, smart, beautiful, though not perfect. No one is perfect," he wrote, "but she made one wrong decision, believing in and trusting you." The statement continued, "She was more important to me than you can ever imagine, and I was more important to her than you ever were. So in a way, you took something from both of us. You took away my mom from me, and you took away her son from her." The jury recommended 20 years for the armed criminal action charge. For the first-degree murder conviction, the judge would decide the sentence. On July 12, 2021, James Addy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 10 additional years. Before being led away, James Addy asked to make a statement. He stood and read aloud a love letter he had written to Molly. He professed his love for her, said how much he missed her, how he wished things had been different. He maintained his innocence, insisted he hadn't killed her, and asked for a new trial, claiming his defense attorney had been ineffective. The judge denied the request. Monroe County Prosecuting Attorney Tally Smith issued a statement. Justice has been served today. James Addy will never be released from prison in the state of Missouri. His actions destroyed two families, the family of his victim, Molly Watson, and his own. James Addy currently sits in a Missouri prison, serving his life sentence. He has filed appeals, still maintaining his innocence, but he remains behind bars, and there he will stay. Molly Nicole Watson was 35 years old when she died. She left behind a son who loved her, a brother who considered her his best friend, parents who cherished her, and friends who knew her as someone creative, unique and full of life. She was someone who sang, who made costumes, who documented her life in video diaries because she wanted to share herself with the world. She was someone who had been in love before, who had experienced heartbreak, and who had allowed herself to be vulnerable enough to love again. Her obituary stated simply, Molly loved her son and spending time with family. She will be greatly missed. The wedding that never happened would have been filled with burgundy and gold. There would have been music and laughter. Molly would have worn one of her two dresses. Finally having made her choice, she would have walked down an aisle toward a future she had dreamed about for 7 years. Instead, that future ended on a dark road in Middle Grove, Missouri, 48 hours before the wedding, killed by the very man she was supposed to marry. The case of Molly Watson reminds us of several truths. That trust is a precious thing, easily broken. That secrets, when kept long enough, become poison. That love, real love, never asks you to hide or to live half a life in shadows. And that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones we don't know at all. As we come to the end of this story, let your mind settle. Let the details drift away like autumn leaves on water. Molly's story is tragic, yes, but she lived. She left behind a son and a brother who carry her memory. And James Addy, the man who took her life to preserve his lies, will spend the rest of his days behind bars. His double life collapsed into a single truth. He is a murderer, and justice, however imperfect, was served. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we journey into a story that unfolds slowly, like autumn leaves drifting to the ground. A story of ordinary lives in a small Illinois town, where beneath the surface of normalcy something dark was taking shape. Let the words wash over you as we explore the tragic case of Norman McCaster. It was late October in 2012. The air in central Illinois carried that crisp bite of approaching winter. Deer season had arrived and hunters were taking to the woods around Springfield, making their way through forests painted in browns and golds. On the 29th day of October, one such hunter was making his way home after a day in the field. He drove along the rural roads near Mechanicsburg, a quiet community where everyone knew their neighbors. As he passed by a creek, something caught his eye near the water's edge. At first glance, it looked like a deer carcass, perhaps left behind by another hunter. But something about it didn't sit right with him. The shape seemed wrong somehow. Still, he continued driving home, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. That night, lying in bed, the image kept returning to his mind. By morning, he couldn't ignore his instinct any longer. He called the authorities. When Sangamon County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the creek, they found something that would haunt them for years to come. What the hunter had seen was not a deer. It was human remains. But these were not ordinary remains. The body had been dismembered with surgical precision. The head was gone, the hands were missing, the feet had been removed. All that remained was a torso, abandoned in the quiet woods like discarded refuse. Chief Deputy Joe Roche arrived at the scene. In his more than 20 years in law enforcement, he had seen many things, but this was different. The brutality of it, the calculated nature of the dismemberment, spoke of something deeply disturbing. "We do not see this type of crime in Sangamon County," he would later say. The immediate assumption was that this had to be gang-related, drug-related, the work of organized criminals from outside their peaceful community. The coroner began the difficult work of trying to identify the victim, without a head, without hands, without any identifying features. It seemed like an impossible task. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure this person could never be identified. But they had made one crucial mistake. Near the body, about 30 feet away, investigators found 2 receipts. They were from Walmart. The items purchased included a reciprocating saw, cleaning supplies, and plastic sheeting. The receipts were dated the same day the body was believed to have been dumped. It was a small clue, but it was something, a thread they could pull. While investigators worked to trace those receipts, let me tell you about a young woman named Juatasha Denton. In many ways, she seemed like the embodiment of the American dream. Born in 1988 in Illinois, she had grown up attending church regularly, surrounded by family and friends who knew her as sweet, genuine, and dedicated. In high school, Juatasha excelled. She was an honors student, the kind of young woman teachers pointed to as an example. She had plans, ambitions, a future that stretched bright before her. Her friends described her as someone who never failed at anything. Failure simply wasn't in her vocabulary. At school, she met a boy named Norman Raymel McCaster. Norman was born on June 18, 1990, and those who knew him described him as a wonderful young man with a kind heart. He and Jutasha were high school sweethearts, the kind of couple that made people smile. Young love blooming in the halls of an Illinois high school.
Norman joined the Army National Guard, serving his community and country with pride. His father, Marcel, was incredibly close to him. They had the kind of relationship where they spoke nearly every day, where Norman would never make a decision without talking it through with his dad first.
Juatasha and Norman's relationship grew serious. They decided to get married, standing before their families and promising to love each other through whatever came. Juatasha was 22 years old. Norman was also 22. They moved to Springfield together, starting their new life as husband and wife. Juatasha enrolled at the University of Illinois Springfield, continuing her education while Norman served in the National Guard. To their neighbors, to their community, they seemed like any other young couple navigating the early years of marriage. They attended church. They went about their daily routines. Nothing seemed amiss, but beneath this surface of normalcy, something was shifting. Back at the crime scene, investigators were making progress. The Walmart receipts they'd found were traced to a credit card. When they ran the name on that card, they found themselves staring at something unexpected. The card belonged to Juatasha Denton McCaster, a college student, a church-going young woman with no criminal history, someone who had recently moved to the area with her husband. It seemed impossible that someone like her could be connected to such a brutal crime. Investigators decided to look deeper. They discovered that Juatasha's husband, Norman McCaster, had recently missed a mandatory National Guard drill. For someone as dedicated as Norman, someone who took his service seriously, this was highly unusual. They tried to contact him, but there was no response. Detectives decided to pay Juatasha a visit. When they knocked on her door, she greeted them with a smile. She invited us into her house, was very genuine. Sweet, asking us if we wanted something to drink. Sergeant Vest would later recall. They sat on her couch, and she seemed completely at ease. When they asked about Norman, Juatasha explained that he had left. She told them that their marriage had been struggling because of Norman's drug addiction. She said he had gone off with some people from St. Louis, drug users who had come to take him away. She didn't know what kind of car they drove. When asked what Norman had taken with him, she said simply, just the clothes on his back. She hadn't reported him missing. She hadn't called his family. She hadn't seemed worried at all. The detectives left her house, but something felt wrong. They decided to speak with Norman's father, Marcel. When they told him that Norman had supposedly run off with drug users, Marcel's reaction was immediate and certain. "You must not know my son and the relationship me and him have," he told them. He's not going to run off without telling me or calling me. Marcel insisted his son didn't use drugs. The picture Giacha had painted didn't match the Norman that his family knew. The detective's suspicions deepened. They obtained a DNA sample from the National Guard and compared it to the remains found in the woods. The results came back as a match. The torso found by that hunter, dismembered and discarded, belonged to 22-year-old Norman Raymond McCaster, Natasha's husband. When Marcel received the call confirming his son's death, he later said it tore him. At first, investigators wouldn't tell him the manner of death. But when he arrived at the police station and they revealed what had been done to Norman, how his body had been cut apart and scattered, Marcel felt a rage he'd never known before. He wanted to hurt whoever had done this to his son. Even though all signs pointed to Tasha, investigators found it hard to believe. How could this petite, meek, mild-mannered woman with no criminal history have committed such a heinous crime? State's Attorney John Millicer voiced what everyone was thinking. How could this young church-going woman have done this? But they couldn't ignore the evidence. They placed Tasha under 24-hour surveillance. They watched as she went about her normal life, shopping, going to class, seemingly unbothered by her husband's disappearance. One day, they watched as she took her trash to the curb. The moment it hit the curb, it became public property. Investigators moved in and seized the garbage bags. What they found inside was chilling. First, there were floor tiles. Why would someone throw away floor tiles from their bathroom? It seemed odd, suspicious. The tiles were sent to a crime lab, where they would test positive for blood. Then there were bottles. Multiple bottles of Visine eye drops. Investigators were puzzled at first. Why would someone have so many bottles of eye drops in their trash? But then they learned something disturbing. The active ingredient in Visine, tetrahydrozoline, can be fatal if ingested in large quantities. It was a poison that could kill, and it was difficult to detect. But the most damning discovery came in another bag. This one wasn't filled with garbage at all. It was filled with men's clothing, soldiers' uniforms, the unmistakable fatigues of the National Guard. As investigators sorted through the clothing, they found an identification card. It belonged to Norman McCaster. Tasha had thrown away her husband's entire wardrobe, his uniforms, everything that proved he had ever lived in that house with her. She was erasing him, piece by piece. With enough evidence to justify search warrants, investigators obtained permission to search Tasha's home and seize her laptop computer. What the forensic examination revealed was a window into premeditation, into months of planning. The computer searches had started around the beginning of June, months before Norman's death. The search history read like a manual for murder. How to kill your husband. How to kill a spouse and get away with it. Ways to kill someone and not get caught. Poison tasteless but deadly. How much Visine does it take to kill? The searches went on and on. A chronicle of someone methodically researching how to end another person's life. These weren't impulsive searches made in a moment of anger. They were calculated, repeated over weeks and months. Someone was planning, learning, preparing. In Tasha's house, investigators found more evidence. There was a handwritten list on a piece of paper. It read, "Registered gun and bleach walls." They discovered that tiles had been removed from the bathroom floor, and they examined the area beneath. Chemical tests reacted positively to blood. Someone had tried to clean up a crime scene. There was also something odd that detectives had noticed during their first visit. On the kitchen wall hung a calendar. Their 2-year wedding anniversary, October 26th, had been completely blacked out. Someone had taken a marker and obliterated the date. Their 2-year anniversary was coming up, and Norman McCaster was not going to make that 2-year anniversary. State's Attorney Milheiser would explain. And she was going to make sure of it. As the investigation continued, detectives learned about a crucial piece of evidence. A fellow student at the University of Illinois Springfield came forward with a disturbing story. Tasha had approached him and asked to borrow a gun. He had loaned it to her, not thinking much of it at the time. A day later, she returned it. But when he checked the weapon, he noticed something. 2 bullets were missing. Prosecutors believed those 2 bullets had been fired into Norman's head. That's why his head had to be removed with a reciprocating saw. The evidence of gunshot wounds would have been too obvious, too easily traced back to the borrowed weapon. The theory that emerged was methodical and chilling. Tasha had likely attempted to poison Norman first, using the Vezanine. Toxicology reports would later confirm that Norman had elevated levels of tetrahydrozoline in his liver, but perhaps the poison hadn't worked quickly enough, or perhaps Norman had realized something was wrong. So she had used the gun, and then, in the bathroom of their home, she had used the reciprocating saw to dismember his body. Norman weighed over 200 pounds. In order to move him to transport him, she had to cut him into smaller pieces. Or perhaps, as prosecutors theorized, she was trying to make identification impossible by removing his head, hands, and feet. Anything that could be used to identify him through dental records or fingerprints. Investigators believed she had used a dolly to move the torso. Surveillance footage from various stores showed her purchasing all the supplies she would need. A saw, plastic sheeting, cleaning supplies, everything required for the grisly task ahead. Armed with overwhelming evidence, detectives brought Tasha in for questioning. They showed her the search warrants for her home and for a sample of her DNA. They made it clear this was a homicide investigation. Tasha seemed almost confused. "I mean, am I under arrest or something?" she asked. "Yup," the detective replied. "You're under arrest for the concealment of a homicide." On November 26th, 2012, Tasha Denton McCaster was formally charged with first-degree murder, dismembering a body, concealing a homicidal death, and obstructing justice. She was held on a $5 million bond. The community was in shock. This quiet, church-going student, this young woman who seemed to have everything going for her, was accused of murdering and dismembering her own husband. It didn't fit any profile, any expectation, but the evidence was undeniable. The trial began in early 2014. For days, the prosecution laid out their case, piece by damning piece. They presented the Walmart receipts that had been found near Norman's body. Store surveillance footage showed Tasha purchasing the reciprocating saw on the same day Norman was believed to have been killed. They presented evidence from the trash, the soldiers' uniforms, the floor tiles with traces of blood, the bottles of Vezanine that suggested an attempted poisoning. They showed the jury Tasha's computer search history, that months-long digital trail of someone researching murder. They called the fellow student who had loaned Tasha the gun, who testified that it came back missing 2 bullets. They presented testimony from the forensic toxicologist, who had found elevated levels of tetrahydrozoline in Norman's liver. Dr. Scott Denton, the pathologist who had performed the autopsy, testified that he couldn't determine the exact cause of death because he only had the torso to examine. Without the head, without being able to see if there were gunshot wounds or trauma to the skull. The precise moment of Norman's death remained uncertain, but the evidence of foul play was overwhelming. Throughout the trial, Tasha maintained her innocence. She tried to use her faith, her church involvement, her clean record as a defense. But as many observers noted, going to church doesn't automatically make someone a good person. Actions speak louder than appearances. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the blood tests weren't definitive, that there were other possible explanations, but the mountain of evidence was too high to climb. After more than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict on April 1st, 2014. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, dismemberment of a human body, concealment of a homicidal death, obstruction of justice. On June 25, 2014, Tasha Denton McCaster stood before Judge Peter Kavanaugh for sentencing. The judge noted something significant. Even after being convicted, she had not shown remorse or accepted responsibility for what she had done. The judge sentenced her to 78 years in prison. 55 years for first-degree murder, 20 years for dismemberment, 3 years for concealment of a homicidal death. The sentences would run consecutively, meaning she would have to serve them one after another. State's Attorney John Milheiser addressed the court. This was a planned execution of her husband. She planned it for months and months. She was convicted and sentenced. It was just a brutal crime. Norman's family was in the courtroom. His mother, Frederica Moresby, spoke about finally having closure, though the pain would never truly leave. I'm happy, she said through tears. It just hurts. Marcel Norman's father struggled to articulate the depth of his loss. He revealed that he mourned his son in private, not wanting to burden the rest of the family with his grief. "Every morning I go out to the car," he said. "I'll sit there and I'll cry because that's how much I miss him. He meant a lot to me." Giatasha appealed her sentence, arguing that 78 years was excessive, given her lack of prior criminal history. But the appellate court upheld the sentence in 2017. The brutality of the crime, the months of planning, the complete lack of remorse, all of it justified the lengthy sentence. To this day, Norman's head, hands, and feet have never been recovered. Investigators believe Giatasha disposed of them in a body of water somewhere, possibly during a trip to Chicago. Those parts of Norman, the pieces that would have made identifying him easier, remain lost. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you wonder, as many have wondered, what drives someone to such an act? What makes a person who once promised to love and cherish someone then plan their methodical destruction? Investigators believe that Giatasha had grown discontent with her marriage. Perhaps it wasn't living up to the perfect image she had in her mind. Remember, she was someone for whom failure was not an option. Someone who always succeeded at everything she tried. When her marriage began to crumble, when that perfect life she had envisioned started to crack, something in her snapped. Instead of pursuing a divorce, instead of seeking counseling or simply walking away, she made a different choice. She chose to eliminate the problem entirely. For months she researched and planned. She gathered supplies. She borrowed a gun. She made her preparations with the cold precision of someone approaching a task to be completed. Some have theorized that there were issues of control, of a perfectionist unable to accept that something in her life wasn't going according to plan. Others have suggested that perhaps there were financial considerations or secrets that haven't come to light. The truth, known fully only to Giatasha herself, remains locked behind prison walls. Norman's family remembers him not as a victim, not as a crime statistic, but as the loving son, the dedicated soldier, the young man with his whole life ahead of him. They remember his smile, his dedication to his family, the way he would never make a decision without calling his father first. They remember the Norman who existed before October 26, 2012, before his 2-year anniversary that he would never reach. As of today, Giatasha Denton McCaster remains incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Illinois. She will be in her 90s before she becomes eligible for release. There are no public records of her participating in rehabilitation programs or showing any remorse for her actions. The case sent shockwaves through the community of Springfield and Mechanicsburg. It prompted discussions about domestic violence, about the hidden troubles that can lurk behind closed doors, about the importance of recognizing warning signs. It reminded investigators that evil doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it wears the face of a college student, a churchgoer, someone with no criminal history and every advantage in life. The hunter who found Norman's remains that October day went back to his life. But the image of what he saw by that creek surely haunts him still. The detectives who worked the case, who sifted through trash and pieced together the puzzle, carry with them the memory of one of the most brutal crimes their county had ever seen. And Marcel Banks sits in his car some mornings and cries for his son, for all the conversations they'll never have, for all the moments that were stolen when someone decided that Norman McCaster's life was expendable. Let this story settle over you like a heavy blanket. Let it remind you that behind every headline, every crime statistic, there are real people whose lives were forever changed. Norman was real. His dreams were real. His love for his family was real. And in the end, despite all the planning, all the attempts to hide the evidence, all the lies and manipulations, the truth emerged. It always does. Justice may be slow, but it is persistent. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we're going to explore a case that reminds us how the search for connection in our modern world can sometimes lead down unexpected paths. This is the story of Nikki McFadder, a young woman whose life was cut short in the spring of 2009. Let your breathing slow. This story unfolds at a gentle pace. We'll move through the details of what happened on those fateful days in May. Charlotte, North Carolina, in the late 2000s was a city of constant motion. At Charlotte Douglas International Airport, thousands of travelers passed through the terminals each day, their journeys facilitated by the airline employees working behind the ticket counters. Among these workers was Nikki McFadder. She was 30 years old in 2009, a woman who had always known what she wanted from life and how to pursue it. Those who knew her described her as goal-oriented, someone who moved through the world with purpose and determination. Nikki's journey had begun in September of 1978. After graduating from high school, she made a choice that would shape her early adult years. She joined the United States Navy, following a path of service that took her away from civilian life and into the structured world of military duty. It was a significant commitment, one that spoke to her character and her willingness to challenge herself. When her time in the Navy came to an end, Nikki returned to civilian life with that same sense of direction. She found work with U.S. Airways as a ticketing agent at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. It was steady work, professional work, the kind of position where she could interact with people from all walks of life as they passed through the airport on their way to destinations unknown. But Nikki wasn't all business. According to her older sister, Latoya, who lived outside of Raleigh, Nikki had an adventurous spirit. She loved skydiving. Imagine that for a moment. The thrill of stepping out into open air, the rush of freefall, the controlled descent back to Earth. It was the kind of hobby that suggested someone who wasn't afraid of taking chances, who understood both risk and the importance of preparation. Yet, for all her accomplishments, Nikki found herself single and searching. In 2009, that search increasingly took place online, where dating websites promised to help people find connection in an increasingly digital world. It was through one such site called tag.com that Nikki's path would intersect with a man who would forever alter the course of her life. His name was Theodore Roosevelt Manning IV. Those who knew him called him Teddy. Like Nikki, he was 30 years old. Like Nikki, he was a veteran, having served in the United States Air Force before transitioning to civilian work. He held a job at a power plant in Columbia, South Carolina, about 90 miles south of Charlotte. On paper, on a dating website profile, Teddy Manning might have seemed like a reasonable match. Similar age, military background, employed, the kind of basic compatibility that dating algorithms are designed to identify. The profiles on dating websites, as we know, tell only part of the story. They show us what someone wants us to see, the curated version of themselves they present to the world. The reality is often more complicated. Teddy Manning was charming. He was, by accounts, handsome and soft-spoken, but he was also someone with secrets, with complexities that wouldn't be immediately apparent to someone scrolling through his profile photos and reading his carefully crafted bio. Nikki and Teddy began talking online in February of 2009. Eventually, their communication moved from the digital realm to the physical world. They began dating. Since Teddy lived in Columbia and Nikki lived in Charlotte, it fell to Nikki to make the drive south on weekends when she wanted to see him. 90 miles each way. Not an impossible distance, but not insignificant either. For about 3 months, this pattern continued. Nikki would make the drive to Columbia. They would spend time together. She would return to Charlotte to her job, her friends, her life. But as the weeks passed, Nikki began to notice things that troubled her. Teddy's behavior suggested that he wasn't interested in the kind of relationship Nikki was seeking. He wanted something casual, something without commitment. More concerning, it became clear that Nikki wasn't the only woman in his life. Teddy was dating multiple women simultaneously. He would later admit to investigators that he was involved with 6 different women at the same time. For Nikki, who had been searching for genuine connection, this was disappointing. She had invested time and emotional energy into this relationship, making those drives back and forth, hoping for something more substantial to develop. But Teddy's actions made it clear that he had different intentions. By early May of 2009, Nikki had reached a decision. She confided in her sister Latoya that she was planning to end the relationship, but there was a practical matter to address first. She had given Teddy some of her jewelry to have repaired, and she wanted it back before severing ties completely. On May 6th, 2009, Nikki made what would be her final drive to Colombia. The morning of May 6th began ordinarily enough for Nikki McFadder. She got into her black 2003 Honda Accord, the one with the North Carolina license plate that read Fadder, a personalized touch that made her car distinctive and easy to identify. She drove south from Charlotte toward Columbia, retracing the familiar route she had traveled many times over the previous 3 months. The drive would have taken her about 90 minutes, depending on traffic. Interstate 77, cutting south through the Carolinas. Nikki arrived at Teddy Manning's home in Gadsden, a community in South Carolina, around 9 in the morning. His residence was on Bluff Road. According to what Teddy would later tell investigators, Nikki's purpose in coming was to have a conversation about their relationship. What exactly was said between them in those morning hours? We cannot know with complete certainty, but we know the general substance of the conversation. Nikki wanted more from the relationship. She wanted commitment, exclusivity, the things that people typically want when they're looking for a genuine partnership. Teddy, on the other hand, maintained that he only wanted something casual, that he wasn't interested in the kind of relationship Nikki was seeking. There was the matter of the jewelry as well. Nikki wanted it back. This was part of the reason for her visit, to collect her belongings and make a clean break. The conversation, by all accounts, became an argument. Emotions ran high, two people wanting fundamentally different things, realizing that there was no path forward that would satisfy them both. At some point around mid-morning, at approximately 11:45, Nikki used her phone to call friends back in Charlotte. She told them she needed gas to get back home. This detail is important. It tells us that at 11:45, Nikki was alive and planning to return to Charlotte. She was looking ahead to the drive home, but Nikki McFadder would never make that drive. What happened after that phone call is a matter of evidence, testimony, and conflicting accounts that would be scrutinized in a courtroom more than a year later. But the basic facts are undeniable. Theodore Manning shot Nikki McFadder in the back of the head in an upstairs room of his home. The fatal wound came from a bullet that entered her skull from behind, traveling forward and upward. This detail, the trajectory of the bullet, would become important later when investigators tried to reconcile Teddy's various explanations of what happened. According to what Teddy would eventually tell police, after changing his story multiple times, he and Nikki had gotten into a fight. He claimed that Nikki had found his handgun and picked it up, that he wrestled it away from her, that in the struggle the gun went off. But the physical evidence, the location of the wound, the trajectory of the bullet, didn't support this version of events. Eventually, after continued questioning, Teddy Manning admitted something different. He admitted that he had intentionally pulled the trigger, that he meant to kill Nikki McFadder. After shooting Nikki, Teddy Manning faced a choice. He could call the police, report what had happened, face the immediate consequences of his actions, or he could try to make the problem disappear. He chose the latter. Teddy picked up his phone and called someone, another woman in his life. Her name was Kendra Danette Goodman. She was 27 years old, a single mother of 2, and like Nikki, she was one of the women Teddy was seeing. In his world and the way he had structured his romantic life, women were fungible, interchangeable. They were people he kept in rotation, calling them when he wanted company, keeping them at arm's length emotionally. When Kendra arrived at Teddy's home on Bluff Road, she found him working on a black Honda. According to her later testimony, Teddy told her the car belonged to a friend and asked if she would follow him while he drove it, to return it to its owner, then give him a ride back home. It was a simple request, the kind of favor one might ask of an acquaintance. What Kendra claimed she didn't know, at least not at that moment, was that Nikki McFadder's body was in the trunk of that black Honda. They left Teddy's home with Teddy driving Nikki's car, and Kendra following behind in her gold Chevrolet Lumina. Their destination was a remote area in Fairfield County off Peach Road near Interstate 77. They pulled into the parking lot of a church. Calvary Church. Kendra waited there while Teddy continued down an adjacent dirt road, driving Nikki's Honda deeper into the woods, away from the main road, away from casual observation. When Teddy returned, he was on foot. He got into Kendra's car, and together they drove to a gas station on Bleederwood Road. There they purchased beer and gasoline. Then they returned to Peach Road, back to that church parking lot. This time Teddy got out of the car carrying the gas can. and Kendra's cigarette lighter. He walked away, back down that dirt road into the woods, where he had left Nikki's car. Kendra waited, and then she heard it. An explosion. The sound carried across the distance. It's unmistakable. When Teddy returned to her car, he smelled like gasoline. The scent would have been overwhelming, clinging to his clothes, his skin. What Kendra said she didn't realize at the time was that Teddy had just set fire to Nikki McFadder's car, with Nikki's body still inside the trunk. The explosion she heard was the culmination of his attempt to destroy evidence, to make Nikki disappear, but they weren't finished. Next came a stop at an ATM on Farrow Road. Using Nikki's debit card, they withdrew $500 from her bank account. Surveillance cameras at the ATM captured images of this transaction. The footage would later become a crucial piece of evidence. It showed a man using the card, and investigators would later determine that the car visible in the video, a gold Chevrolet Lumina, matched the description of Kendra's vehicle. After withdrawing the money, they returned to Teddy's home on Bluff Road. Kendra went to her own home. Teddy went to work at the power plant, as if it were a normal day. And according to what both would later admit to investigators, at some point that day after Nikki McFadder had been shot, after her body had been placed in her car, after that car had been set on fire, Teddy Manning and Kendra Goodman had sex. The following day, May 7th, Teddy and Kendra made another purchase together. They went to a Walmart and bought bleach. Then they set about trying to clean up the evidence of what had happened in that upstairs room at Teddy's house. Back in Charlotte, people were starting to worry. When Nikki didn't show up for her shift at the airport, it set off alarm bells. Nikki was reliable. She didn't miss work without explanation. Her sister LaToya, living outside Raleigh, grew increasingly concerned when she couldn't reach Nikki. Nikki had told her about the plan to drive to Columbia, to end things with Teddy, to get her jewelry back. But now she wasn't answering her phone. On May 11th, 5 days after Nikki had driven to Columbia, LaToya reported her sister missing to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Investigators immediately suspected that something was wrong. They knew Nikki had traveled to Columbia. They worried she hadn't made it back. The question was what had happened to her during that trip. The first place they needed to look was obvious. Nikki had told her sister she was going to see Teddy, so investigators made their way to Theodore Manning's home to question him. Initially, Teddy tried to downplay the relationship. He told investigators that he and Nikki were just friends with benefits. Nothing serious, nothing that would explain why she might have gone missing. He admitted she had visited him on May 6th, but said she left that afternoon and he hadn't heard from her since. But investigators were thorough. They checked bank records and discovered something interesting. On May 6th, Nikki's ATM card had been used at a location in South Carolina. Someone had withdrawn money from her account after she was last heard from. They obtained a search warrant for Teddy's home and executed it on May 22nd, more than 2 weeks after Nikki's disappearance. Inside, they found receipts. Receipts for cleaning supplies, including bleach, purchased on May 7th, the day after Nikki had gone missing. When asked about the bleach, Teddy said it was for a woman he knew. He gave them her name, Kendra Goodman. Investigators went to talk to Kendra, and they noticed something immediately. She drove a gold Chevrolet Lumina. It was the same type of vehicle that appeared in the surveillance footage from the ATM where Nikki's card had been used. At first, Kendra stuck to a story. She said the cleaning supplies were for her. She claimed she knew nothing about Nikki McFadder. But she also admitted that she had a casual relationship with Teddy, that she was another one of his friends with benefits. Investigators weren't convinced. They asked Kendra to take a polygraph test. She agreed, doing so without a lawyer present. The test indicated deception. When pressed harder, confronted with the inconsistencies in her account, Kendra's story began to change. She started talking, and what she told them led investigators to a remote wooded area off Peach Road in Fairfield County. On May 29, 2009, 3 weeks after Nikki McFadder had driven to Columbia to end her relationship with Teddy Manning, investigators found her car. It was in the woods, down a dirt road, exactly where Kendra had described. The black Honda Accord was completely burned. The fire had been so intense that the rims of the wheels had melted. The vehicle was barely recognizable. Inside the trunk, they found human remains, charred, skeletal remains that would later be identified through dental records as belonging to Nikki McFadder. The forensic examination revealed the cause of death. Nikki had been shot once in the back of the head. Bullet fragments recovered from her skull were consistent with a high-point .380 caliber handgun. This matched the type of gun that Theodore Manning had purchased. Within 30 minutes of finding the car and Nikki's remains, investigators obtained a warrant for Teddy Manning's arrest. They went to his home on Bluff Road and took him into custody at 7:04 p.m. on May 29th. The evidence against him was substantial. There was Nikki's blood on the wall of his bedroom. There were the surveillance images of him using her ATM card. There were the receipts for bleach purchased the day after the murder. There was Kendra's testimony about what had happened that day. There were his own statements to police, which had shifted and changed multiple times as investigators confronted him with evidence. Kendra Goodman was also arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact. Prosecutors believed she knew what Teddy had done and helped him cover it up, helping to clean the crime scene and dispose of evidence. The trial of Theodore Manning began in October of 2010, more than a year after Nikki's death. It took place at the Richland County Courthouse in Columbia. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that Teddy Manning had deliberately murdered Nikki McFadder, then engaged in an elaborate cover-up with the help of Kendra Goodman. They presented the physical evidence, the surveillance footage, the testimony of investigators who had worked the case. Kendra Goodman took the stand to testify against Teddy. She admitted she had lied to police 4 times during initial questioning. She said Teddy had coached her on what to say. But now she told the court she was telling the truth. She described following Teddy to Peach Road, waiting in the church parking lot, hearing the explosions, smelling gasoline on him when he returned. She said she was testifying because Nikki's family deserved to know the truth and needed closure. The defense's strategy was to argue self-defense. Teddy took the stand in his own defense, something defendants don't always do because it exposes them to cross-examination. He testified that the shooting was an accident, that Nikki had found his gun and picked it up, that he wrestled it away from her, and that during the struggle the gun went off. But the prosecution hammered at the inconsistencies. If it was self-defense, why had he tried to hide the body? Why had he burned the car? Why had he used Nikki's ATM card? Why had he purchased bleach to clean up the crime scene? Why had he lied to investigators multiple times? And there was the physical evidence. The bullet wound in the back of Nikki's head, the trajectory of the bullet, traveling forward and upward. How did that match with Teddy's story of a struggle over the gun? The trial lasted into a second week. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The jury heard recordings of Teddy's police interviews, listened to him change his story as investigators confronted him with facts. Finally, the case went to the jury. They had to decide, was this murder? Was it voluntary manslaughter? Or was it, as the defense claimed, self-defense? After deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Theodore Manning guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not murder, as the prosecution had hoped, not self-defense, as the defense had argued, but something in between. A finding that the killing had occurred in the heat of passion during a heated argument, but without the premeditation required for a murder conviction. The judge sentenced Teddy Manning to 30 years in prison, the maximum sentence for voluntary manslaughter. Kendra Goodman, who had cooperated with prosecutors and testified against Teddy, was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact. She served approximately 2 years in prison for Nikki McFadder's family and friends. The verdict was disappointing. They believed Teddy deserved to be convicted of murder, to face life in prison. 30 years seemed insufficient for what he had done. Theodore Manning is currently incarcerated at Lee Correctional Institution in Bishopville, South Carolina. According to prison records, he will be eligible for release in 2034, 25 years after Nikki McFadder's death. As for Kendra Goodman, after serving her brief sentence, she returned to civilian life. Her role in the case remains controversial. Some believe she was genuinely unaware of what Teddy had done until after the fact, that she was manipulated and frightened into helping him. Others believe her involvement was more knowing, more willing than she later claimed. What we do know is that Nikki McFadder's death revealed something troubling about Theodore Manning's past. During the trial, information emerged about his history. In August of 2008, about 10 months before he met Nikki, Manning had been charged with criminal domestic violence in the first degree. He had grabbed a 22-year-old woman he had been living with around the neck and choked her. This was the pattern of behavior that had existed before Nikki entered his life. A pattern of violence toward women. Nikki's sister Latoya and her friends, particularly a friend named Fran Eddings, worked hard to keep Nikki's memory alive and to make sure the facts of the case remained in the public eye. They wanted people to remember Nikki as more than just a victim. They wanted her remembered as the goal-oriented Navy veteran, the adventurous skydiver, the young woman working at the airport, trying to build a life for herself. The story of Nikki McFadder is, at its heart, a story about trust misplaced. She met someone online who seemed at first glance like a potential partner, someone with a similar background, similar age, someone who had also served in the military and was building a civilian life. But profiles on dating websites don't reveal everything. They don't show you someone's capacity for violence. They don't tell you about past relationships that ended with police intervention. They don't reveal that the person on the other end of those messages sees relationships as casual, transactional, something to be managed and controlled. Nikki McFadder drove to Colombia on May 6, 2009 to end a relationship that wasn't working and to retrieve her belongings. It was a reasonable thing to do. The kind of thing people do all the time when relationships end. She had no way of knowing that Theodore Manning would respond the way he did. Sometimes in true crime, we look for lessons, for warnings, for ways to protect ourselves from similar fates. But the truth is that violence in relationships is notoriously difficult to predict. People who commit acts of domestic violence don't always show obvious signs beforehand. They can be charming, charismatic, seemingly normal. The violence emerges in moments of conflict, when control is threatened. When someone decides to leave. What happened to Nikki McFadder in that upstairs room in Theodore Manning's home on Bluff Road happened quickly. One moment she was planning her drive back to Charlotte. The next moment, her life was over. She was 30 years old. She had served her country. She had a job she showed up for reliably. She had friends and family who cared about her. She liked to jump out of airplanes on weekends, feeling the rush of freefall before pulling the ripcord and drifting safely back to Earth. All of that ended because Theodore Manning made a choice. A choice to pull the trigger. A choice to prioritize his own desire to avoid consequences over another human being's life. A choice to spend the hours after her death not turning himself in, not calling for help, but trying to erase evidence to make Nikki disappear. But Nikki McFadder didn't disappear. Her sister reported her missing. Investigators searched for her. They found her remains. They built a case. They brought charges. And Theodore Manning was convicted and sent to prison. It wasn't the outcome Nikki's family hoped for. They wanted a murder conviction, wanted life in prison, but it was accountability of a sort. It was a recognition that what Theodore Manning did was wrong, was criminal, was deserving of punishment. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we journey together through a story that reminds us how precious life is, how fragile our moments can be. This is a story of a young woman full of promise, a family's unimaginable loss, and the long road to justice. The lights of Salt Lake City shimmer against the mountain darkness like stars that have fallen to earth. It's a city of contrasts, ancient peaks watching over modern streets, desert heat giving way to alpine cold. On any given night, planes descend into the valley, carrying people home, carrying them to new beginnings, carrying them toward moments that will define the rest of their lives. On the 17th of June 2019, in the deepest hours of the early morning, one such plane touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport. Among its passengers was a 23-year-old woman named Mackenzie Luke. She was returning from California, from her grandmother's funeral, from saying goodbye to a woman she had loved deeply. Mackenzie had no way of knowing that within hours, she herself would be gone, that her own family would soon be searching, hoping, praying for any sign of her, that her name would become known not for the life she lived, but for the way it ended. But before we arrive at that dark conclusion, let us begin where all stories must begin. At the beginning, with a girl who loved the ocean, with a young woman building a future with Mackenzie. Mackenzie Speth Lick was born on the 8th of March, 1996, in the coastal community of El Segundo, California. It's a small city tucked into Los Angeles County, where the scent of salt air mingles with the hum of nearby LAX airport. If you've ever driven along the Pacific Coast Highway, you've passed near the place where Mackenzie grew up. A place of beaches and sunshine, of palm trees swaying against impossibly blue skies. She was not an only child. Mackenzie had 3 brothers, one older, 2 younger, and together they formed the kind of close-knit unit that Southern California childhoods often create. Her parents, Gregory and Diana Luke, built a life centered around their children. Gregory worked in healthcare logistics and administration, while Diana devoted herself to raising their family. They were, by all accounts, good people. The kind of parents who attend every swim meet, who take photos at every milestone. You believe their daughter can accomplish anything she sets her mind to. And Mackenzie did set her mind to many things. At El Segundo High School, she joined the swim team. She played water polo, spending countless hours in chlorinated pools, learning the discipline of competition, the joy of teamwork. Her friends remember her as outgoing, positive, a young woman who lit up rooms simply by entering them. She had that quality some people do of making others feel seen, heard, important. But Mackenzie was also a girl who loved solitude. She would ride her bike to the Pacific Ocean, would sit on the sand and watch the waves roll in, endless and eternal. There's something about the ocean that calls to certain souls. Maybe it's the vastness. Maybe it's the rhythm. Maybe it's the reminder that we are small and the world is large. And there is beauty in both. When it came time for college, Mackenzie made a decision that surprised some who knew her. She chose to attend the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, 700 miles from home, far from the ocean she loved, far from her family's embrace. She wanted to study kinesiology and pre-nursing, following in her father's footsteps toward a career in healthcare. She wanted to help people, to make a difference, to build something meaningful. At the University of Utah, Mackenzie threw herself into campus life. She joined Alpha Chi Omega, a sorority that became her home away from home. In the sorority system, older members serve as mentors, called bigs, to newer members, called littles. Mackenzie was matched with a big named Carly Riley, and the two formed an instant connection. Riley would later say she was drawn to Mackenzie's outgoing personality, her positive energy, her zest for life. Mackenzie and her sorority sisters attended University of Utah football games together, cheering from the MA student section, their voices joining thousands of others in support of the Utes. She made friends easily. Kennedy Stoner, one of her closest companions, would remember how Mackenzie balanced everything. School, work, sorority life. She worked as a personal assistant to a family. Later, she took a job at a biological testing laboratory in Salt Lake City. She was responsible, driven, checking off all the boxes that define adult success. But Salt Lake City was not the ocean. On warm desert days, Mackenzie would recreate her California childhood in her own way, putting on a bikini, basking in the high-altitude sunshine, soaking in warmth and light. She missed the beach, missed her family, but she was building something here, a life, a future, a self. She called her friends Kenzie, not Mackenzie. She expressed feminist opinions. She registered with a third political party, thinking for herself about the world and her place in it. She was 23 years old. A part-time senior because she sometimes reduced her course load to work, because she was financially independent, because she was doing it all on her own terms. She was about to graduate, about to step into the career she had been preparing for, about to become whoever she was going to become. And then her grandmother died. June of 2019. Mackenzie's grandmother, the woman she called Papa Jerry, passed away. Mackenzie was devastated. She had posted on social media about her grandmother being a hero to many, selfless and perfect. A woman Mackenzie never imagined losing, but heaven, she wrote, couldn't wait for her. Mackenzie flew home to California for the funeral. It's one of those weekends that exists outside of normal time. Grief has a way of bending hours, making minutes stretch and compress in equal measure. She spent time with her family, with her cousin. One cousin, Chloe Stevens, would later remember swimming in their grandmother's backyard pool that weekend. the way they had done every summer since childhood. It was the last time Chloe saw Mackenzie alive, the last time she hugged her. She would replay those final moments over and over, wishing she could hold on just a little longer. But Mackenzie had to return to Utah. She had school, had work, had a life waiting for her 700 miles away. On the evening of June 16th, she boarded a red-eye flight back to Salt Lake City. The plane took off into the California night, climbed above the Pacific, traced the familiar path over deserts and mountains. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, on June 17th, the plane touched down at Salt Lake City International Airport. Mackenzie gathered her luggage and texted her mother. Landed. Then, love you, Mama. Simple messages. The kind adult children send to let their parents know they're safe. Diana Luke received these texts and felt the relief every parent feels when their child arrives home safely. But when Diana tried to respond shortly afterward, she noticed something strange. Mackenzie's phone was off, turned off, or dead, or something. Diana tried not to worry. Kids forget to charge their phones. Kids fall asleep. There's always an explanation. Mackenzie exited the airport into the mountain darkness. She ordered a Lyft, a modern convenience that has replaced taxis in our phone-centered world. The driver accepted the ride, pulled up to the terminal, helped Mackenzie load her luggage. She gave him an address, Hatch Park in North Salt Lake. Now this is where the story takes its first strange turn. Hatch Park was not Mackenzie's home. It was not her apartment, not her sorority house, not anywhere she lived. It was a public park about 8 miles from where she was staying. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the Lyft driver would later tell police that during the ride, Mackenzie seemed normal, not distressed, not frightened. She told him she was meeting a friend. When they arrived at Hatch Park, a dark, empty space at that hour, just a parking lot and grass and trees, someone was waiting. The driver saw another car. He saw a person. He helped Mackenzie transfer her luggage from his vehicle to this other vehicle. Mackenzie didn't seem upset. She appeared to know this person. She got into their car willingly. The Lyft driver completed his ride, collected his fare, drove away into the night. He had no reason to think anything was wrong. People meet friends in strange places all the time. Who was he to judge? At 2:58 in the morning, Mackenzie sent a text from her phone. 1 minute later, at 2:59, her phone was turned off. It would never be turned on again. Gregory Luke tried to call his daughter the next day. No answer. He tried again. Voicemail. He sent texts. Nothing. This was unusual. Mackenzie was good about staying in touch with her parents. They had an understanding, the kind many families have. Check-ins, regular communication, the small threads that bind people across distance. When she didn't respond, Gregory felt a cold seed of worry plant itself in his chest. Diana tried too. More calls, more texts, all going into a void where their daughter used to be. They told themselves stories, the way we do when fear creeps in. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she lost her charger. Maybe she's just busy with classes, with work, with life. Young people get distracted. It doesn't mean something's wrong, but the hours became days. June 17th became June 18th, then 19th. Mackenzie missed her midterm exams. She didn't show up for work. Friends started calling the Luke family, asking if they'd heard from her. Mackenzie was supposed to attend a wedding. She missed it. She had a cat in her apartment that needed feeding. The cat went hungry. Finally, on June 20th, 4 days after Mackenzie had last been seen, Gregory Luke called 911. His voice on the recording carries the weight every parent fears. The moment when worry transforms into something darker. I'd like to get, if possible, a wellness check done on my daughter, he said. The Salt Lake City Police Department opened a missing persons case. They started with the basics. When was she last seen? Who saw her last? Where did she go? The Lyft driver's account gave them a starting point. Hatch Park, 3 a.m. Someone in another car. Detectives began reconstructing Mackenzie's digital footprint. In 2019, we all leave trails, texts, social media posts, app usage, location data. The police obtained records from Mackenzie's phone, her social media accounts, her email. What they found painted a picture of a young woman's life, but also revealed something her parents didn't know. Mackenzie used dating apps. Several of them. Tinder, an app called Seeking Arrangement, another called Call Her Daddy. These platforms serve different purposes, some for casual dating, some for more specific arrangements. Seeking Arrangement in particular bills itself as a place where sugar daddies meet sugar babies. Wealthy older men who provide financial support to younger women in exchange for companionship and often intimacy. Mackenzie had multiple arrangements like this. She had advised other women on how to use apps like Tinder to find sugar daddies. She had a separate credit card her father didn't know about, a separate bank account. This was part of her life she kept private, her method of supporting herself financially while pursuing her education. There's no judgment in these facts, only acknowledgement. Many young people navigate the expensive reality of college through unconventional means. What matters is that this online presence gave investigators a lead. On June 22nd, police discovered that Mackenzie had been using TextMe, a third-party messaging application. Her last communications on June 17th had been through this app. Detectives obtained IP address information for the number she'd been texting. They traced it back to a man named Ayoola Ajayi. His name was now written in the case file, and the investigators began to dig. Ayoola Adisa Ajayi was 31 years old. Born in Nigeria in 1988. He had immigrated to the United States and held a green card that allowed him to work and live legally in the country. He had studied computer science at Utah State University, though he never graduated. There were problems during his time there. Issues with his visa, allegations that he'd stolen an iPad. He was barred from campus in 2012, allowed to return in 2015 after resolving his visa problems. He worked in information technology, bouncing between various tech support positions. He had briefly served in the Army National Guard. On paper, he appeared to be an ordinary person, someone trying to build a life, someone navigating the complexities of immigration and employment in American existence. But there were shadows in his history. In March of 2018, Ayoola had invited a woman he'd met on a dating app to his home for dinner. While they watched television on his couch, he began kissing her intensely, trying to touch her inappropriately. When she resisted, when she tried to get away, he pinned her down. He bit her multiple times, hard enough to leave significant bruising and marks. The woman escaped, but she didn't initially report the assault. There was also a rape investigation in 2014 connected to Ayoola, though the alleged victim didn't pursue charges. His ex-wife claimed he would become aggressive when she didn't comply with his demands, that he had threatened to have someone kidnap and kill her. She cut off all communication with him. And then there was the book. In April of 2019, just 2 months before Mackenzie disappeared, Ayoola had self-published a novel on Amazon called Forge Identity. The protagonist is a teenager named Ezekiel, who must choose between joining a criminal mastermind or fighting to escape tyranny. In the book, 2 characters are killed and burned. Ayoola also rented out rooms in his home as Airbnb listings. In April of 2019, he approached a contractor with an unusual request. He wanted a secret soundproofed room, built under his front porch, with head-height hooks on the wall, and a fingerprint scanner for entry. The contractor found the request strange, but didn't report it. According to prosecutors, Ayoola and Mackenzie had met on Seeking Arrangement in 2018. They had communicated sporadically since then. On June 17th, 2019, they arranged to meet after Mackenzie returned from California. On June 22nd, 5 days after Mackenzie disappeared, Salt Lake City police went to Ayoola Ajayi's house. He lived at 547 North 1000 West in Salt Lake City's Fair Park neighborhood, a modest home where he lived and ran his Airbnb business. Detectives knocked on his door. Ayoola answered. When they asked if he knew Mackenzie Luke, if he had ever seen her, he said no. He claimed he didn't recognize her photo, but when they asked about his internet connection and the IP address traced to his house, he said he left his Wi-Fi open to the public because of his Airbnb guests. Someone else must have used it, he suggested. Police showed him his phone. They asked about Seeking Arrangement, the app installed on his device. Ayoola was evasive, but agreed to let them look through some of his records. The detectives left, but they kept investigating. Phone records told a story Ayoola wasn't telling. The data showed that both Mackenzie's phone and Ayula's phone had been at Hatch Park within less than 1 minute of each other. At approximately 3 a.m. on June 17th, both phones had then traveled to Ayula's address. Mackenzie's phone was turned off. Ayula's phone was turned off when he arrived back at his house, unusual behavior for someone who claimed he was never there. On June 26th, 9 days after Mackenzie vanished, police obtained a search warrant for Ayula's property. They brought a cadaver dog, a dog specially trained to detect the scent of human remains. The dog was led into Ayula's backyard. Almost immediately, the dog indicated on a disturbed area of earth near the back of the property. Neighbors had noticed something strange in the days after June 17th. They had seen Ayula burning something in his backyard, a large fire unusual and troubling. One neighbor, a woman, had yelled at him to put it out or she would call the fire department. The fire was so intense, so out of place in a residential neighborhood, that it alarmed multiple people. A man who was renting Ayula's basement through Airbnb witnessed some of this. He told police that on the morning of June 17th, Ayula had asked him to go to Smith's grocery store. They went together. Ayula purchased a gas can. They went to a gas station and filled the can. When they returned to the house, the renter took a shower. When he came back outside, there was a fire burning in the backyard. Pallets stacked against the fence. A white door, all engulfed in flames. Ayula claimed he was just burning trash because his garbage cans were full. The renter, who was from Texas, told Ayula this wouldn't be allowed where he came from, but he didn't call the police. He didn't want to get involved. Now, with the search warrant, with the cadaver dog indicating on that spot in the backyard, investigators began to dig. They found human bone, charred muscular tissue, part of a scalp with hair still attached. A cell phone melted, destroyed, but identifiable. Personal items burned beyond recognition. DNA testing confirmed what the investigators already suspected in their hearts. These were Mackenzie Luke's remains. But this was only part of her. Where was the rest? On June 28th, 11 days after Mackenzie disappeared, police arrested Ayula Ajayi. He was charged with aggravated murder, aggravated kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and desecration of a human body. During subsequent interrogation at the police station, while his house was being searched, Ayula acted confused, distressed. He asked why he was being questioned. "This is terrible," he said. "I just want this to be over." When detectives pressed him, he began to hyperventilate. Medics were called to assess him, to help him control his breathing. He appeared cooperative, offering passwords to his phones and laptops, access to his security system, but he denied everything. He claimed he and Mackenzie had never met in person. He said it would be weird to meet at that time of night, that it wouldn't be safe for either of them. He suggested that maybe Mackenzie had stopped responding to his messages after he sent her a picture showing he was black, implying racial prejudice on her part, attempting to deflect blame. The security footage from his house told a different story. The system showed that on June 17th, in the hours before he left to meet Mackenzie at Hatch Park, Ayula had deliberately turned off his security cameras. He didn't want any video evidence of Mackenzie being at his house, and there was more to find. Ayula's phone records showed that after June 17th, his phone had pinged in Logan Canyon, a remote mountainous area 85 miles north of Salt Lake City. On July 3rd, nearly 2 weeks after Mackenzie was last seen alive, police searched Logan Canyon based on this phone data. In a shallow grave in a wooded area, covered with brush, they found the rest of Mackenzie Lewick. Her body was charred from fire. Her arms were bound behind her back with a zip tie and rope. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the left side of her skull, a hole where part of her skull and scalp were missing. An autopsy would later determine that this trauma caused brain hemorrhaging. She had also been strangled. The medical examiner concluded that Mackenzie died from the blunt force trauma and strangulation, but the precise sequence of events, what happened first, what happened last, only one person truly knew. For more than a year, the case moved through the criminal justice system. Ayula Ajayi was held without bail. Evidence was compiled. The prosecution prepared for trial, including the possibility of seeking the death penalty. More victims came forward. The woman he had assaulted in March 2018 finally reported what happened to her when she saw news coverage of Mackenzie's death. During the investigation, police also found child pornography on Ayula's computer. 19 images depicting children between the ages of 4 and 8. Additional charges were filed. Then in October of 2020, Ayula made a decision. Rather than face trial and the possibility of execution, he agreed to plead guilty. His defense attorney Neil Hamilton stood in court and spoke the words that gave Mackenzie's family some measure of truth, if not peace. Mr. Ajayi had decided that he would murder Miss Leake before the meeting took place. Hamilton said, the murder was planned, premeditated. Before Ayula ever left his house to meet Mackenzie at Hatch Park, he had already decided she would die. Hamilton explained what happened after Mackenzie got into Ayula's car at the park. They drove to his house in the Fair Park neighborhood. Once inside, Ayula tied Mackenzie's hands behind her back with zip ties and rope. He began to choke her with his hands. Mackenzie protested. She told him to stop. He didn't stop. He moved her onto her stomach and continued strangling her with a belt until she stopped moving, until she stopped breathing, until her heart stopped beating. Then he burned her body in his backyard. The fire his neighbors saw. The fire that had alarmed the Airbnb renter. The fire that consumed flesh and bone. He attempted to destroy the evidence of what he'd done. When that proved insufficient, when he realized the police were investigating, he moved what remained of Mackenzie's body to Logan Canyon, 85 miles away, and buried her in a shallow grave. Why? The district attorney said there was no clear motive, no profit motive, no obvious anger, nothing that made sense to ordinary minds trying to understand extraordinary evil. There isn't one here, Sim Gill said, other than murder for murder's sake. In exchange for his guilty plea to aggravated murder and desecration of a human body, Ayula Ajayi was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also pleaded guilty to forcible sexual abuse in connection with the March 2018 assault on the other woman. The child pornography charges were dropped as part of the plea agreement, though their existence remained part of the public record. On October 23, 2020, Ayula Ajayi stood in a courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, glasses, and a blue surgical mask. This was during the pandemic, when even grief and justice had to be conducted through barriers and distance. The courtroom was nearly empty due to COVID restrictions. Only Mackenzie's family, the attorneys, and the judge were allowed inside. Everyone else watched via live stream. Mackenzie's family took turns speaking. Their words carried the weight of 16 months of anguish, of questions without answers, of nights wondering if their daughter had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had called out for them. Diana Luke, Mackenzie's mother, described her daughter as kind, loving, caring, a true spitfire. She said the sentence would not bring Mackenzie back, but she hoped it would keep Ayula out of the public eye, unable to commit these heinous crimes again. Gregory Lueck, Mackenzie's father, was angrier. He looked at the man who had murdered his only daughter and said he hoped Ayula would spend the rest of his life in isolation. He said he looked forward to the call from Utah officials informing him that Ayula had died. I can only hope that it will be a slow, painful death, Gregory said. He added that he had no compassion for Ayula because Ayula had shown no compassion toward Mackenzie. I'm not sure you even have anything to look forward to in the afterlife, he said. If you believe in that. The father spoke of what would never be. My daughter Mackenzie Luke was a sweet, amazing young lady with the world ahead of her. She was a kind-hearted person that cared about others. Now I will not have the opportunity to see her blossom in life. They would never see her graduate from college, never see her start her nursing career, never see her get married, never hold her children, never watch her become whoever she was supposed to become. All those possible futures, all those unlived moments gone, erased by one man's decision to take what was not his to take. Mackenzie's cousin, Carly Stevens, spoke through tears. This is a nightmare you can't wake up from. I will never be able to forgive what happened to her. I will never forgive the monster who took her life. Never in my life have I felt anger the way I have the last 16 months. Never have I been so fearful for my life, because I know how real evil is in this world. Another cousin, Chloe Stevens, remembered those last moments at their grandmother's pool. I replay those final moments together in my head over and over, stricken with grief that I cannot somehow keep her with us just a little bit longer. The pain of Kenzie's loss and the permanent fracture it has left in our family is indescribable. It haunts me daily that I was not able to protect her. But when it was his turn to speak, Ayula Ajay hung his head. His voice muffled by his mask, he said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I deserve what I'm going to get. I know this won't bring her back." District Attorney Simgil told the media afterward that he didn't believe the apology was genuine. The judge, Vernice Trees, sentenced Ayula to life in prison without parole for the murder, plus 1 to 5 years for desecrating Mackenzie's body, and 1 to 15 years for the sexual abuse of the other victim. She ordered the sentences to run consecutively, one after the other, which was largely symbolic given the life sentence, but she felt it important to acknowledge all of Ayula's victims, all of the harm he had caused. The Find Mackenzie Luke Gate Facebook page, which had drawn thousands of followers during the search, was eventually taken down. The posters that had been hung throughout Salt Lake City were removed. Life, as it does, moved forward for everyone except Mackenzie. Her sorority sisters graduated. They started careers, got married, had children, all the things Mackenzie would have done. They think of her, they remember. Her family continues on, carrying a wound that will never fully heal. Gregory and Diana Leok still live in El Segundo, California, in the house where Mackenzie grew up, where her childhood bedroom sits exactly as she left it. Parents should never have to bury their children. It violates the natural order of things, the way we expect life to unfold. Ayula Ajayi is incarcerated in the Utah State Prison, where he will remain until he dies. He is in his mid-30s as of this recording. Statistically, he could live another 40 or 50 years behind bars. Every morning when he wakes up, every night when he goes to sleep, he is there, and Mackenzie is gone. Sometimes people ask why these stories matter. Why revisit such darkness? Why speak of these things at all? Perhaps because remembering is a form of resistance against erasure. Mackenzie Leek was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a co-worker, a sorority sister. She loved the ocean. She played water polo. She was building a life, making choices, becoming herself. She deserved to live that life fully, to make mistakes and have triumphs, to grow old and look back on her youth, with wisdom and nostalgia. What was taken from her cannot be restored, but what remains, her story, her name, the love her family still carries, that cannot be taken. It endured. Rest softly now. Let the story settle in your mind like dust after a storm. Remember Mackenzie Leek. Remember that every life has value. Every person matters. Every moment is precious, because we never know which moment will be our last. The night is deep. The world is sleeping, and somewhere, somehow, we hope that Mackenzie has found the peace that was stolen from her on that dark morning in June. May she rest in eternal light. May her family find comfort in knowing she is remembered. May we all hold our loved ones a little closer. May we cherish the ordinary moments that constitute a life. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.